He painted the most famous smile in history. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. Leonardo da Vinci wasn't just a painter, he was a scientist, an inventor, an architect, a philosopher. And his life? A wild genius ride that feels more like a movie than real history. By the way, where are you watching from? And what time is it over there? Let me know down in the comments. I always love seeing how far this community stretches across the world. In the quiet hills of Tuscany on April 15th, 1452, a child was born in a small village called Vinci. The world didn't notice. There were no grand celebrations, no royal decrees, no noble lineage to make this birth feel significant. And yet, this boy, Leonardo, would one day change the way humanity sees everything. He was born out of wedlock. His father, Ser Piero da Vinci, was a respected notary in the nearby city. His mother, Caterina, was a poor local woman, likely a maid or a farmer's daughter. Their brief union broke no rules of love, but it placed Leonardo in a difficult position. In 15th century Italy, being illegitimate was a mark. It meant you couldn't inherit your father's estate. You couldn't attend the finest schools. You weren't quite inside society, but not entirely outside it either. Leonardo grew up between two worlds. On one side was the educated, refined life of his father's household. Papers, contracts, conversations about politics and property. On the other side, the earthy, grounded life of the countryside, animals, fields, the smell of wet stone after rain. And maybe it was this duality, this mix of refinement and raw nature that shaped the way his mind worked. From an early age, Leonardo stood apart. He didn't just see the world, he observed it. A bird's wing wasn't just feathers to him, it was an engineering marvel. The way water rippled over rocks fascinated him more than most children could ever explain. He was quiet, curious, and constantly lost in thought. Not the kind of child you scold, but the kind you quietly worry about, because his head always seemed somewhere far away. Unlike other boys his age, Leonardo didn't train to be a merchant or a lawyer. He didn't memorize religious doctrine to prepare for the priesthood. Instead, he watched ants carry leaves. He drew sketches in the dirt with sticks. He studied how shadows moved on walls. He had no formal schooling beyond basic reading and writing. He never learned Latin properly, the language of science and law at the time. But where others saw this as a limitation, Leonardo turned it into liberation. He learned not from books, but from the world itself. The world never expected anything from Leonardo da Vinci, but he expected everything from the world. And that was the beginning of everything. As Leonardo grew into boyhood, it became clear. He didn't interact with the world the way others did. He didn't just look, he watched. Not with casual glances, but with intense, deliberate focus. While other children ran through the fields chasing games, Leonardo lingered behind, crouching low, studying how a lizard moved across a rock or how the veins of a leaf fanned outward like rivers. He noticed the flight of birds, how their wings curved, how their feathers caught the air. He stared at flowing water for hours, watching how it curved around obstacles, how it created ripples and spirals. And the sky? He looked at clouds the way most people look at paintings. This wasn't aimless daydreaming. This was research, primitive, instinctual, untrained, but profoundly focused. He had no formal science, no mathematics, no philosophy. But Leonardo was conducting experiments, quietly, with his eyes. Most of what we know about this part of his life comes not from documents, but from his drawings and notes years later. Even as an adult, he would recall in remarkable detail the things he had observed as a boy. The structure of plants, the way light danced through trees, the swirling patterns of dust kicked up by wind. He began to draw. Not scribbles, not childish stick figures, but deeply detailed sketches. Animals, faces, plants, and strange creatures born from his imagination. Art was more than talent. For Leonardo, It was the language he used to explain the world to himself. He had no mentor yet, no guidance. But his eyes were already becoming his first teacher, and nature his first classroom. He asked endless questions. Why is the sky blue? Why do bats fly differently than birds? Why does a cat always land on its feet? Adults gave him simple answers, or none at all. But Leonardo wasn't asking for answers. He was building a library of questions. This relentless curiosity, even as a child, made him different. It also made him lonely at times. He was quiet, thoughtful, and deeply internal. Not the kind of child to speak out loud, but one who whispered thoughts to himself, sketched them into dirt, and stored them in his mind like treasures. Even then, it was obvious. Leonardo wasn't just in the world. He was already trying to understand how it worked. Long before Leonardo mastered the written word, he was already fluent in a different language, the language of images. As a child, his hand moved constantly, not to write letters or numbers, but to draw. He drew everything. Twisted tree roots, birds in mid-flight, the aging face of a man sitting in the market. He could observe something for only a moment, and then recreate it with almost unnerving accuracy. People around him took notice. Not just family, but neighbors, merchants, even his father. His sketches weren't stiff or lifeless. They had movement. He captured tension in a horse's muscles, the spark in a beggar's eye, the delicate flutter of a bird's wings. He wasn't copying life, he was translating it. His father, Ser Piero, began to keep some of these drawings, at first probably out of amusement or pride, but then, perhaps with a growing sense of realization, this boy was different. At that time, the Renaissance was blooming in Florence. Art, science, and innovation were shaping a new world, and yet, for a child born out of wedlock, access to elite education was still closed. He couldn't attend the traditional universities. Latin, the language of scholars and science, remained elusive. But Leonardo didn't seem to mind. He wasn't learning through textbooks. He was learning through trial, touch, and vision. And through it all, his drawings grew more precise, more detailed, more alive. He began to draw things he hadn't even seen yet. Imaginary animals, machines, strange devices powered by gears and pulleys. Even at a young age, he was blending reality with invention. Art and engineering had already begun to merge in his mind. One story tells of young Leonardo creating a shield for a family friend. But instead of a traditional family crest, he painted a monstrous creature so terrifying, complete with fire-breathing snakes and sharp claws, that it stunned the recipient. Leonardo's imagination wasn't just active, it was boundless. And yet, for all his talent, Leonardo remained quietly observant. He didn't boast, he didn't demand attention, he just kept drawing. Drawing, for Leonardo, wasn't a pastime. It was his first form of thinking. It was how he made sense of what he saw, and eventually it would become the foundation of everything he would do. By the time Leonardo was a teenager, his drawings had begun to attract more than just curious glances. They sparked genuine interest, especially from his father, Ser Piero, who recognized that his son's gift was far beyond what most young boys could ever hope to achieve. Florence during the mid-15th century was more than a city, it was a crucible of genius. Art, architecture, philosophy, and innovation thrived in the narrow stone streets. Great minds like Botticelli, Donatello, and even a young Michelangelo walked those same paths. If there was anywhere a boy like Leonardo could bloom, it was there. At age 14, Ser Piero took Leonardo's drawings to one of Florence's most respected artists, Andrea del Verrocchio. Verrocchio was no ordinary painter. He was a sculptor, goldsmith, engineer, and designer. His workshop was a hub of talent, a place where gifted apprentices could learn the crafts of painting, anatomy, mechanics, and more. Verrocchio accepted Leonardo into his studio, and just like that, the boy from Vinci stepped into a world of artistic intensity and limitless learning. As an apprentice, Leonardo didn't start with paints and brushes. First, he learned the fundamentals: grinding pigments, preparing canvases, sketching drapery, mixing gesso, and casting metal. It was laborious work, humbling. But it was in this disciplined environment that Leonardo's talent began to crystallize into something more powerful: skill. He studied alongside other apprentices, watching, mimicking, refining, but quickly it became clear Leonardo wasn't just learning, he was outshining. One day, Verrocchio began a painting, the Baptism of Christ. As was customary, he assigned parts of the painting to his apprentices. Leonardo was tasked with painting one of the angels. When the painting was complete, legend says Verrocchio was stunned. Leonardo's angel was so graceful, so detailed, and so alive that it made the rest of the painting feel flat by comparison. Verrocchio reportedly put down his brush and never painted again, whether that story is true or just poetic myth. One thing is certain: Leonardo had arrived. In Verrocchio's studio, he wasn't just a student. He was becoming a master in the making. And Florence was just the beginning. In Verrocchio's bustling workshop, surrounded by the scent of oil paint and the hum of quiet concentration, Leonardo quickly moved from apprentice to standout. Every stroke of his brush carried a level of sensitivity that seemed beyond his years. His understanding of light, form, and anatomy wasn't just technical, it was almost instinctive. He observed the way a wrist twisted when someone poured water, the tension in a calf muscle as someone climbed stairs, the quiet grief in a mother's eyes holding her child. He didn't just paint what he saw, he painted what he felt. But what truly separated Leonardo from his peers wasn't just talent. It was the way his mind worked. Most artists followed rules, proportions, perspective, formulas handed down by generations. Leonardo questioned them all. Why did shadows soften at the edges? How did a smile change depending on the viewer's angle? What made the human body harmonious? And how could that harmony be captured in motion? In the same years that he was painting, he began studying anatomy, physics, geometry, and engineering, not from books but through direct observation. He would sketch mechanical devices one day and the muscles of a horse the next. And yet, despite his growing brilliance, Leonardo wasn't seeking fame. He was introverted, thoughtful, and often hesitant to finish his work. He could spend weeks on a single hand in a painting, obsessing over each curve and contour until it felt alive. To him, the work wasn't just about pleasing patrons, it was about getting it right. But word of his abilities spread fast. Patrons began requesting his presence. Artists began whispering his name with a mixture of admiration and envy. Even Verrocchio, his master, began to defer to Leonardo's judgment in certain artistic matters. There's something poetic about it. How the student, quiet and curious, slowly began casting a shadow over the very man who taught him. But Leonardo didn't stay to bask in the limelight. That was never his way. After years in Verrocchio's studio, he began taking on commissions of his own. He would step out of the workshop and into the world. The boy from Vinci was now a name in Florence. And soon he would become something much bigger. A mind too vast for one city to contain. Florence in the late 15th century was more than a city, it was a living masterpiece. Every street corner held a sculpture, every chapel a fresco, every square a gathering of minds. And in the middle of it all, Leonardo da Vinci walked quietly, observing everything. By his early 20s, Leonardo had left Verrocchio's studio and begun life as an independent artist. He was now a recognized talent, though not yet the towering legend we know today. His name was beginning to float through the city, softly but steadily. He received commissions, painted altarpieces, portraits, and sketches for churches. And yet, he struggled to finish them. This wasn't laziness or rebellion, it was obsession. Leonardo would begin a piece with energy and ambition, but as soon as his curiosity moved on, so did he. He couldn't force himself to finish what no longer fascinated him. He was searching for something deeper than deadlines, something more precise than public praise. And that need for perfection made him unpredictable in the eyes of patrons. Still, the work he did complete during this time spoke volumes. His use of light and shadow, what artists would later call chiaroscuro, added a level of drama and depth that hadn't been seen before. His figures felt real, breathing, thinking. More than once, people said his paintings seemed more alive than the people they depicted. But Florence wasn't just shaping Leonardo, it was challenging him. The city was full of brilliance, Botticelli, Ghirlandaio, Pollaiuolo, and soon a young Michelangelo would begin rising through the ranks. Competition was fierce. But Leonardo wasn't trying to outshine anyone. He wasn't interested in rivalry. He was interested in truth, and truth to Leonardo could not be found in studios alone. So he wandered to the Arno River, where he studied the movement of water, to the hills outside the city, where he sketched landscapes with almost meditative focus, to the markets, where he watched faces, expressions, gestures, all the subtle things that make us human. He was an artist, a scientist, a philosopher, but above all, he was a student of the world. And as Florence watched him rise, Leonardo was already looking towards something beyond paint and canvas. He was beginning to dream in inventions, and what came next would take him far from home. By the late 1470s, Leonardo had gained a solid reputation in Florence, but something in him felt unsettled. He had talent, he had recognition, he had work, but Florence, for all its beauty, had become too familiar, too political, too tied to tradition. Leonardo's mind needed more space, more freedom. He wasn't content to paint what others told him. He wanted to build, to explore, to invent. So in his early 30s, Leonardo made a bold decision. He left Florence and traveled north to Milan, a city ruled by the ambitious and flamboyant Duke Ludovico Sforza. But Leonardo didn't arrive in Milan as a painter. He came with something else entirely. He brought the Duke a letter, an application of sorts, where he barely mentioned his painting skills at all. Instead, he described himself as a military engineer. He promised to design bridges, cannons, armored vehicles, water systems, and siege engines. He laid out how he could help fortify cities, divert rivers, and even sculpt grand monuments to the Duke's glory. Only at the end of the letter, almost as a footnote, did he mention that he could also paint. This wasn't false humility, it was strategy. Leonardo understood Milan, a city of power and politics, a city that valued machines over masterpieces. If he wanted a place at the Duke's court, he had to speak the language of utility. And it worked. The Duke accepted him. Leonardo was now more than an artist. He was an official court thinker. He was given freedom, tools, and a new playground for his mind. Here, in Milan, he would design weapons of war, though it's unclear if he ever intended them to be used. Many scholars believe his war machines were too complex, too idealistic. Some think he proposed them as a way to gain favor, while quietly hoping they'd never leave the page. But Leonardo's arrival in Milan marked a turning point. He wasn't just painting faces anymore. He was sketching gears, pulleys, flying devices, and fortified cities. His notebooks, once full of gentle studies of nature, were now bursting with mechanical dreams. Florence had made him an artist. But Milan would push him to become something even greater. Not just a painter of the world, but a reinventor of it. Milan, under the rule of Ludovico Sforza, was a city of ambition. It was powerful, strategic, and always preparing for war. Leonardo da Vinci, now in his 30s, had positioned himself not as an artist, but as a military engineer, a builder of machines, a solver of problems. And he took that role seriously. In his notebooks, Leonardo sketched out plans for inventions unlike anything Europe had seen. Giant crossbows large enough to bring down city walls, armored vehicles that could roll into battle, spitting fire from rotating cannons, bridges that could be built and dismantled in minutes for quick-moving troops, spiked chariots, diving suits, multi-barreled guns, water pumps, cranes, and fortifications. Some of his designs were practical, others impossibly complex. But that wasn't the point. Leonardo wasn't just building tools for war, he was building the future. Many of his machines would never be constructed in his lifetime. Some weren't even physically possible with the materials of the 15th century. But the ideas, they were breathtaking, centuries ahead of their time. Still, behind the designs was a curious contradiction. Leonardo hated violence. He wrote about the horrors of war, the cruelty of man, and the destruction it left behind. His notes speak of peace, of harmony, of nature's balance. So why design weapons? Some believe he did it to survive, to secure patronage in a world obsessed with power. Others think he used the opportunity to explore physics, force and motion under the guise of engineering. Perhaps he believed that understanding destruction was necessary to preserve life, and yet, even while sketching war machines by day, Leonardo's notebooks remained filled with human anatomy, botanical studies, and geometric puzzles. His mind was never in just one place. While working in the Duke's court, he was also producing plays, organizing festivals, designing costumes, and advising on architecture. He was everywhere, yet always chasing something deeper. Milan gave Leonardo the space to explore all his curiosities. But it also began a slow transformation. He was no longer just observing the world. He was trying to control it, to rebuild it, mechanically, beautifully, logically. Leonardo wasn't a soldier, he wasn't a politician. He was something far rarer, a man who could turn imagination into blueprint. And in a time of swords and power, that made him dangerous, brilliant, and unforgettable. While many at court saw Leonardo da Vinci as a painter or engineer, those titles barely scratched the surface of what was unfolding inside his mind. Beneath the silk robes and courtly duties, Leonardo was quietly building something far more powerful than any war machine, an entire internal universe, and the evidence of that universe lives in his notebooks. Page after page, filled with tiny mirrored handwriting and delicate sketches, drawings of birds mid-flight, rotating gears, human organs, cathedrals, and whirlpools. There were no rules, no boundaries. To open one of Leonardo's notebooks is to step into a brain that never stopped asking, what if? He didn't just draw what he saw, he reimagined what was possible. One page might show a flying machine inspired by the wings of a bat, complete with levers, pulleys, and counterweights. Another might show a robot knight that could move its limbs. He designed a primitive helicopter, a scuba diving suit, even an early version of a car, powered by wound-up springs. These ideas weren't copied. They weren't borrowed. They were original, and that's what made Leonardo different. Where most people saw the world as it was, Leonardo saw the world as it could be. His inventions weren't always practical, but they weren't supposed to be. They were expressions of pure imagination, grounded in deep observation. And while many of his devices were never built in his lifetime, modern engineers who've reconstructed them say one thing consistently: they work. But here's the twist. Leonardo never published these notebooks. He didn't seek credit. He didn't push his inventions into the hands of kings or merchants. Instead, he hoarded his thoughts like treasure, locking them inside pages only he could read. Why? Some say he feared his ideas would be misused, especially the machines of war. Others believe he was simply a perfectionist, unwilling to share something he hadn't fully understood himself. But maybe he just didn't care about legacy. He wasn't building for applause. He was building because he had to. These notebooks, over 7,000 pages in total, would remain scattered, hidden, and forgotten for centuries. But inside them, he had already mapped out a future the world wasn't ready for. Leonardo da Vinci didn't just invent machines, he invented possibility. In the heart of Milan, tucked inside the quiet refectory of the convent of Santa Maria delle Grazie, Leonardo da Vinci began what would become one of the most iconic and studied paintings in all of human history, The Last Supper. Commissioned by Duke Ludovico Sforza, the mural was to be the centerpiece of the dining hall, where Dominican monks took their meals. But for Leonardo, this was not just a religious scene. It was a psychological puzzle, a moment of raw human emotion, captured at its most fragile point. The scene is taken from the Gospel of John. the exact moment when Jesus reveals to his 12 disciples that one of them will betray him. Most painters before had shown the moment with calm figures, gently arranged around a table. But Leonardo did something different. He gave each apostle a unique reaction: shock, confusion, grief, guilt. You can almost hear the murmurs, the clatter of dishes, the weight of that one sentence sinking into the room. Jesus, calm and centered, forms the still point of the composition, his figure creating a triangle, the classic symbol of balance and divinity. Meanwhile, the disciples erupt around him in waves of movement, hands gesturing, faces twisted with disbelief. And then there's Judas, not separated or hidden as other painters had done. Leonardo placed him in the same row as the others, but partially shadowed, recoiling, his hand inches from a small bag of silver. Everything in the painting is intentional, down to the salt spilled near Judas's elbow, a subtle symbol of bad luck and betrayal. But Leonardo, ever the experimenter, took a risky path. Instead of using traditional fresco technique, which required fast work on wet plaster, he used a dry surface, hoping to achieve more detail and depth. It worked at first, but over time, the paint began to flake and decay. Humidity, pollution, and war nearly destroyed it. What we see today is a heavily restored fragment of what once was. And yet, even in its damaged state, the Last Supper still stuns. It isn't just a painting. It's a window into the mind of a man who saw not just bodies, but souls. A moment of silence, frozen in time, held together by genius, emotion, and an almost painful sense of humanity. By the time Leonardo da Vinci had completed The Last Supper, his fascination with the human body had moved far beyond paint and canvas. He didn't just want to capture how people looked, he wanted to understand how they worked. He wanted to know what moved a hand, what made a smile, what secrets were hidden beneath the skin. So he began dissecting. It was illegal, it was dangerous, and it was deeply frowned upon by both church and society. But Leonardo did it anyway, quietly, obsessively, often working late into the night in candlelit morgues and hospitals. He dissected not just one or two bodies, but dozens: old men, young women, children, even animals. Each dissection was an act of discovery. With every incision, he peeled back mystery. He drew what he saw with stunning precision: muscles, tendons, organs, nerves, even the valves of the human heart. One of his sketches shows the heart with such detail it wouldn't be fully confirmed by medical science for hundreds of years. Another notebook shows a fetus curled in a womb. Drawn with such care and tenderness, it's hard to believe it came from a man working in total secrecy. He didn't just draw anatomy, he explained it. He noted how the spine curved, how the lungs expanded, how the blood flowed. He was centuries ahead of his time, proposing ideas about circulation and physiology that wouldn't be taught in schools until the 20th century. And still, no one knew. Because Leonardo never published his anatomical work, it stayed hidden in notebooks, scrawled in mirror writing, shared with almost no one. Why? Maybe he feared backlash from the church? Maybe he felt it was incomplete. Or maybe, just maybe, he was so consumed with understanding that exploration was the reward, not recognition. To Leonardo, the human body wasn't just a machine, it was a universe, a structure of divine design, where art and science met beneath the skin, where muscle met spirit and every tendon held a secret worth uncovering. He painted the body in beauty, but he studied it in truth, and in doing so he became not just the world's greatest artist, but one of its first great anatomists. To understand Leonardo da Vinci, one must enter his notebooks. Thousands of pages filled with sketches, diagrams, and thoughts that spilled from his mind faster than he could control them. But there's something curious, almost magical, about how he wrote them. He wrote backwards, every line, every word, every letter, reversed, like it had been reflected in a mirror. At first glance, it seems like a code, a secret script hiding forbidden knowledge, but the truth may be simpler. and more fascinating. Leonardo was left-handed, and writing left to right with ink often caused smudges. So he flipped the direction. It wasn't encrypted, it was practical. Yet the effect was the same. His thoughts became unreadable to most. His journals weren't meant for the world. They were meant for him. And what a world they contained. One page might hold an elegant drawing of a flower's symmetry. The next, a breakdown of human facial muscles, followed by a list of water flow experiments, then suddenly notes on the flight patterns of birds. There was no order, no chapters, just stream of consciousness brilliance. He jumped from mathematics to philosophy, from engineering to poetry. He would write questions to himself in the margins. Why is the sky blue? What causes yawning? Where does the soul reside in the body? He asked, and he sketched. Not because anyone demanded it, but because he had to know. His notebooks weren't just records. They were mirrors of the mind, reflecting the vast, tangled, beautiful chaos of his thoughts. He recorded observations from nature, how light bends through water, how a cat lands on its feet, how clouds gather before a storm. He wrote lists of things he wanted to learn: dissect a lion, study the moon's reflection on water, measure the jaw of a crocodile. It wasn't ambition, it was hunger, pure, endless curiosity. And yet, for all their genius, these notebooks remained private. Leonardo didn't publish them. He didn't seek applause. They sat in drawers and leather cases, scattered and forgotten after his death. Centuries later, they'd be rediscovered, stunning the world, because in those mirrored pages was proof that one man 500 years ago could think like the future. He wasn't writing for fame, he was writing to understand the universe and himself. If there was one mystery Leonardo da Vinci could never let go of, it was flight. To him, it wasn't just a question of mechanics. It was a symbol of ultimate freedom. He watched birds for hours, sometimes days, hawks gliding, swallows darting through air. He even bought birds at the market just to release them, observing how they launched themselves back into the sky. What made them fly? What secret did nature give them? That man had not yet discovered. In his notebooks, Leonardo returned to this question again and again. He sketched hundreds of flying machines, winged contraptions with pedals and pulleys, flapping devices inspired by bats and birds, a parachute with a pointed canopy, even an early concept of what we now call a helicopter, a spiral screw of linen meant to twist upward into the air. Some of these ideas were elegant, others were impractical, but all of them had one thing in common. They came from observation. Leonardo studied how air flowed over wings, how birds shifted weight, how feathers moved with the wind. He believed flight wasn't magic, it was physics. Understandable, replicable, achievable. And yet, in his lifetime, none of his machines ever flew. Why? Partly the materials of the time couldn't support the weight or precision needed. But there was something else. Leonardo was a perfectionist. He often stopped building because the design in his mind was better than the one his hands could produce. Still, he didn't give up the dream. Even when distracted by commissions, court life, or anatomical studies, he always returned to flight. And perhaps, deep down, he understood that the attempt mattered more than the result. To seek what others thought impossible, to dream beyond the constraints of his age, to believe, truly believe, that man could soar. Centuries later, many of Leonardo's flying concepts would inspire real engineers. His parachute was successfully tested in modern times. His wing studies influenced the field of aerodynamics. His vision lived on. He never left the ground. But he gave the world wings, and in doing so, Leonardo da Vinci proved something timeless, that imagination, rooted in observation, can outfly even the heaviest of limitations. Around the year 1503, back in Florence after years in Milan, Leonardo da Vinci began a portrait that would become the most famous painting in the world. It was small, simple at first glance, just a woman seated calmly, hands folded, her gaze meeting yours. But there was something else, a curve of the lips, a softness in the eyes, a smile so subtle, so elusive, that it would go on to fascinate the world for centuries. Her name was Lisa Gherardini, the wife of a wealthy Florentine merchant, but we know her as the Mona Lisa. Leonardo approached this portrait differently. He didn't just want to capture her appearance, he wanted to capture her essence. He worked slowly, layering thin glazes of oil paint to build depth and texture. He used a revolutionary technique called sfumato, where edges and colors gently blur into one another, just as they do in nature. There are no harsh lines, no outlines, only transitions, like a dream softly unfolding. And then there's the background, a surreal misty landscape with winding rivers, distant mountains, and a sky that seems to exist outside of time. But the heart of the painting is her face. Her smile is both present and absent, warm and distant. It seems to change as you move, almost alive. Some say she's smiling at a secret. Others think she's smiling at you. Leonardo never delivered the painting to its commissioner. He carried it with him for the rest of his life, tweaking, adjusting, studying. He worked on it for years, far longer than any standard portrait required. Why? Maybe it became something more than a commission. Maybe it became a mirror, not of Lisa, but of Leonardo himself, a reflection of his obsession with light, shadow, emotion, and mystery. It's not just the most famous painting in the world because of what it shows. It's famous because of what it doesn't explain. No one knows exactly when he considered it finished. Maybe he never did. But what he left behind was not just a portrait, it was a puzzle. One that invites every viewer into the same quiet question. What is she thinking? And somewhere, perhaps, Leonardo is smiling too, knowing we're still trying to find the answer. The Mona Lisa is more than just a painting. It's a presence, quiet, still, yet deeply alive. What makes her so captivating? It's not her clothing or the muted palette or even the mysterious landscape behind her. It's her smile, that impossibly delicate curve that has defied explanation for centuries. From a distance it's warm, almost inviting, but step closer and it begins to vanish. Is it joy? Is it sadness? Is it a mask? The answer shifts with the light, with the angle, with the mood of the viewer. Leonardo understood something few artists had before, that the human face is never still. Emotions flicker like candlelight, faint, fleeting, real. He tried to capture not a moment frozen in time, but a moment in transition. To achieve this, he studied muscles. He observed laughter, grief, serenity. He watched how lips curved, how cheeks lifted, how eyes narrowed ever so slightly when someone held back a thought. And then he painted that, not the expression itself, but the suggestion of one. He famously said, "Painting is a mental thing." And nowhere is that more evident than in the Mona Lisa's expression, because what you see depends on how you feel. Her smile doesn't speak, it listens. That's why millions still stand before her, day after day, drawn in, searching. Some feel peace, others feel haunted, but no one walks away unchanged. And perhaps that was Leonardo's intention all along, to paint not a woman, but a conversation, to create a piece of art that looked back at you, that made you the subject. It's easy to forget that this painting was created over 500 years ago by a man with no access to cameras, no scientific instruments to measure light and shadow, only his eyes, his hands, and his relentless curiosity. And yet, the result is timeless. The Mona Lisa isn't just famous because of art critics or museum placement. She's famous because she feels alive. In that mysterious smile lives all of Leonardo's genius, his love of subtlety, of emotion, of nature, of science. He gave the world a face that could never be forgotten. And in doing so, he quietly ensured something else, that he never would be either. Despite his growing fame and the unmatched beauty of his works, Leonardo da Vinci was never truly at rest. His success didn't ground him, it stirred something deeper, a quiet dissatisfaction, a constant pull toward what was next. By the early 1500s, he had returned to Florence, then left again, then back, then gone. Cities changed, patrons changed, But one thing stayed the same. Leonardo kept moving. He wasn't chasing wealth or titles. He was chasing something far more elusive: understanding. In Florence, he found new commissions. He began work on a massive mural known as the Battle of Anghiari, a chaotic swirl of warriors and horses. It was meant to be his greatest fresco, but he never finished it. The paint didn't dry correctly. The vision became too complex. He abandoned it, leaving only sketches and fragments. Some say he feared it would never live up to what he saw in his mind. Others say he simply lost interest. Leonardo's restlessness wasn't a weakness. It was a side effect of genius without a finish line. When something was understood, it no longer fascinated him. He moved on, not out of boredom, but because his curiosity was like a flame that constantly needed new fuel. He studied engineering for canals and urban planning. He dissected more bodies in search of answers about the soul. He sketched flying machines one day, and the geometry of leaves the next. To many around him, he seemed unpredictable, unreliable even. But to Leonardo, everything was connected: art, science, anatomy, nature, mechanics. He wasn't jumping from topic to topic. He was weaving a single, invisible thread through them all. Still, his wanderings made it hard to maintain steady patronage. He left Florence again, traveling to Rome, where the great artists of the age, Michelangelo and Raphael, were already thriving under papal commissions. But Rome would not offer Leonardo the same warmth. He was older now, slower, more contemplative. The world around him was shifting toward younger, more dramatic talents. But Leonardo didn't compete, he observed. He reflected. He wasn't done exploring. Because even as the world celebrated his past, Leonardo was already dreaming of the next great mystery. He wasn't just a master of movement on canvas. He was a man forever in motion. In 1513, Leonardo da Vinci arrived in Rome, the heart of the Renaissance and the center of a changing world. Here, power flowed not just from kings, but from the Pope. Religion shaped politics, art, science, and ambition. And in this city of grandeur and belief, Leonardo found himself surrounded by giants. Michelangelo, brooding and intense, was sculpting his Last Judgment. Raphael, young and adored, was painting the Vatican rooms with divine brilliance. Their names were rising stars, their works dramatic and immediate. And in contrast, Leonardo, now in his 60s, seemed like a relic from a gentler age. He had no grand commissions in Rome, no papal projects. He was given a workshop and a stipend, but not the spotlight. The church admired beauty, but it feared questions, and Leonardo had many of them. He was fascinated by the mechanics of nature, the way water moved, how light bent, how the body functioned. But the church still viewed certain studies, like human dissection or theories about the earth's age, with suspicion. So he worked quietly. He continued his studies of anatomy. He designed irrigation systems, sketched ideas for cathedrals and machines. But increasingly he felt isolated, not out of place but out of time. Rome was beginning to embrace boldness, muscles, drama, power, Leonardo's subtlety, his patience, his endless curiosity. It didn't fit the era's appetite for spectacle. And perhaps something deeper troubled him. He had always believed that truth could be found in observation, that nature, not dogma, revealed the secrets of existence. But in Rome, those ideas could only be whispered. He didn't reject religion, but he didn't blindly follow it either. He believed in cause and effect, in the language of the universe, written in structure and pattern, not just scripture. It's no surprise then that he began to withdraw. While Michelangelo clashed with patrons and Raphael charmed the elite, Leonardo faded into the background, content to draw, study, and think. His rivals were celebrated in cathedrals. He was chasing the pulse of the world itself. Leonardo didn't need to win the approval of popes, because he had already built a cathedral of his own, one made of thought, wonder, and impossible questions. And unlike stone, that kind of cathedral could never crumble. As the years passed, Leonardo da Vinci grew quieter. Not in mind, his thoughts were as vibrant as ever, but in presence. He no longer sought crowds or applause. He preferred long walks, still mornings, and the company of just a few trusted souls. By now, he was in his 60s, an age considered elderly in the 16th century. His hair had turned white. His hands, once so steady, had begun to tremble. But his eyes still watched the world with the same hunger they had held as a boy in Vinci. He lived a private life, and a mysterious one. Leonardo never married. He had no known children. His relationships were quiet, complex, and often left out of the history books. He kept a small circle, most notably Francesco Melzi, a young nobleman who became his assistant, companion, and closest friend. Melzi wasn't just a helper, he was Leonardo's shadow, organizing his papers, preserving his drawings, absorbing his ideas. It was to Melzi that Leonardo entrusted his manuscripts, his secrets, his life's work. Another frequent companion was Salai, a former pupil with a reputation for mischief. Their relationship was long, sometimes turbulent, and deeply debated by historians. But whatever the truth, it was clear. Leonardo did not live entirely alone. He chose his solitude carefully, but he was never fully isolated. Still, people wondered about him. There were whispers about his sexuality, his secrecy, his refusal to conform. He dressed simply, yet elegantly. He was kind, yet distant. He avoided gossip, politics, and fame. He lived not to impress, but to understand. And while others aged into comfort or status, Leonardo aged into introspection. His notebooks by this point were overflowing, filled with anatomy, astronomy, machines, reflections on nature, even riddles and jokes. He left behind drawings of water eddies beside philosophical notes about the soul. His curiosity had no borders. What's most astonishing is this. Even in his final years, he was still learning, still experimenting, still sketching. The man who had once captured the smile of a Florentine woman was now looking inward, searching for truths not just about the body, but about existence itself. Leonardo da Vinci's life may have seemed quiet in these final chapters, but inside his mind, the storm never stopped. By 1516, Leonardo da Vinci's time in Italy was drawing to a quiet close. He was older now. His fame was undeniable, but his body had begun to betray him. His right hand, likely paralyzed from a stroke, could no longer paint with the grace it once had. The man who once captured the finest details of smiles and shadows now struggled to hold a brush. And yet, the world still wanted him. That same year, a powerful admirer extended an invitation that would shape Leonardo's final years. King Francis I of France. Young, intellectual, and endlessly curious, Francis saw in Leonardo not just an artist, but a treasure, a living embodiment of Renaissance brilliance. He offered him a generous pension, a beautiful home near the royal chateau in Amboise, and complete freedom to pursue his work, free from deadlines or expectations. Leonardo accepted. He crossed the Alps on a mule, accompanied by his trusted assistants, Melzi and likely Salai too, carrying with him his notebooks, his sketches, and a few unfinished paintings, including the Mona Lisa. He settled into Clos-Lucé, a charming manor just steps away from the king's residence. The two men would meet often, walking the gardens, talking about art, science, architecture, and philosophy. Francis called Leonardo the greatest man who ever lived. It wasn't a palace Leonardo needed, it was peace. And in France, he finally found it. He continued sketching designs for architecture, hydraulic systems, even grand palaces that blended geometry and nature. Though his health declined, his mind remained sharp, always returning to the same questions: movement, form, balance, the divine laws behind all things. There were no grand commissions now, no more court politics, just time, time to reflect, time to teach, time to breathe. And though he was far from his birthplace, far from Florence and Milan, Leonardo was content. He had nothing left to prove. In France, he was not just tolerated, he was cherished. It's poetic in a way. A man born out of wedlock, denied formal education, questioned and underestimated, would spend his final days as a guest of kings. Leonardo da Vinci had once painted smiles. Now, at last, he had found his own. In the final years of his life, nestled within the peaceful walls of Clos Lucé, Leonardo da Vinci continued to do what he had always done: observe, question, and wonder. Though his right hand had weakened, his left still guided the pen. Slowly, carefully, he continued to fill the margins of his notebooks. They came less frequently now, and with more restraint, but they were no less profound. He wrote about water, its power to carve mountains, its dance with light, its symbolism as the lifeblood of all things. He wrote about geometry, exploring spirals, fractals, and the golden ratio hidden in seashells and flowers. He reflected on death too, not with fear, but with curiosity. One note reads, "Just as a well-spent day brings happy sleep, so a well-employed life brings a happy death." It wasn't poetry, it was peace. Leonardo had lived his life in service of knowledge, not for glory, not for wealth, but for the joy of understanding. He still sketched, slowly, methodically, his ideas for architectural marvels, city plans, machines of movement and motion, all carefully mapped out, as if he knew the world might someday catch up to his mind. But now, more than ever, Leonardo turned to teaching. He passed on his thoughts to Francesco Melzi, his faithful student and companion, making sure the notebooks would survive. He knew his time was limited. He felt it. And yet, there was no panic, no unfinished race. He had spent decades chasing answers, only to realize the real beauty was in the pursuit itself. Each final page of his notebooks feels like a whisper, a final breath from a mind that never stopped reaching. Even in silence, Leonardo was still listening to the universe, to the way wind-shaped trees, to how light touched stone, to how thought could live on in ink and image. There were no crowds now, no commissions, no applause, just a quiet room, filled with drawings, questions, and sunlight drifting across ancient paper. And as he wrote his last lines, Leonardo wasn't focused on legacy. He was still doing what he had done since childhood. He was paying attention. The year was 1519. Leonardo da Vinci, now 67 years old, was nearing the end of his long, extraordinary life. His body, once strong and tireless, had grown fragile. His right side remained weakened by a stroke. His energy came in short waves, and even simple movements had become slow and deliberate. But his mind remained awake. In the calm of Clos Lucé, with the French countryside blooming outside his window, Leonardo spent his final days in reflection. He was surrounded not by grand crowds or students clamoring for lessons, but by a few loyal companions. Chief among them was Francesco Melzi, now more than just a pupil. He was Leonardo's confidant, his scribe, his final connection to the world. Leonardo knew the end was close. He began to prepare. He reviewed his notes, organized his sketches, and gave clear instructions for what should happen to his works. He wrote his will with care, ensuring that Melzi would inherit his manuscripts and be the keeper of his legacy. He left money to his servants, to the poor, and even to Salai, his complicated and long-standing companion. There is a legend, unconfirmed but often told, that King Francis III, Leonardo's admirer and patron, came to visit him on his deathbed. Some say the king cradled Leonardo's head in his arms as he passed, calling him a man who would never be replaced. Whether it happened or not doesn't matter. What matters is this: Leonardo da Vinci died on May 2nd, 1519, in a small room far from his birthplace. He had no children, no heirs. But he left behind something far more enduring, an entire universe of ideas. He was buried in the chapel of Saint-Hubert, not far from the Château d'Amboise. His grave is quiet, modest, almost hidden, but his mind, his questions, his visions, his hunger to understand, those never went into the ground. In his final days, Leonardo wasn't mourning what he hadn't done. He had lived fully, thought endlessly, dreamed boldly. And when the end came, it wasn't the close of a life. It was the quiet turning of a page in a book that the world is still reading. Leonardo da Vinci had no museum to preserve his work, no massive tomb to announce his name. When he died, his genius didn't instantly echo across Europe. In fact, for a time, it began to fade. His most valuable possessions, his notebooks, filled with sketches, inventions, and philosophical questions, were entrusted to Francesco Melzi, the loyal pupil who had stayed by his side until the end. Melzi understood their worth. He protected them. But after Melzi's death, those priceless pages began to slip through the cracks of history. Some were given away, others were sold, some were lost, hidden in drawers, or split among collectors who didn't fully understand what they were holding. Thousands of Leonardo's handwritten pages were scattered across Europe, torn from their original bindings, passed from hand to hand, and sometimes forgotten entirely. Entire notebooks disappeared. Drawings were mislabeled. Ideas that could have changed science were buried in private collections. For centuries, Leonardo was remembered mostly as a painter, the man behind the Last Supper and the Mona Lisa. But the full scope of his genius, his engineering, anatomy, astronomy, botany, and physics remained hidden in fragments. It wasn't until the 19th and 20th centuries that scholars began to piece his writings back together. Page by page, image by image, they began to see the real Leonardo, not just the artist, but the visionary, the scientist, the dreamer. The rediscovery of his notebooks stunned the world. Here was a man sketching helicopters 400 years before flight. Here was a man dissecting the human body with modern medical precision. Here was a man who saw the patterns of nature with the eyes of a poet and the mind of a mathematician. And suddenly Leonardo wasn't just part of history. He was ahead of it. Today, many of his manuscripts are preserved in museums and private libraries, still studied, still admired. But even now, experts believe there are pages missing, ideas lost, secrets yet to be uncovered. It's a strange irony. Leonardo da Vinci, the man who wanted to understand everything, had his own legacy nearly lost to time. And yet, like his paintings, like his smile, like his questions, it returned quietly, powerfully, and just in time. Leonardo da Vinci lived in the 15th and early 16th centuries, an age of candlelight, parchment, and superstition. Yet his mind operated like it belonged centuries in the future. He envisioned machines that couldn't be built with the materials of his time. He described systems the world didn't have the language to explain. He thought in blueprints, while others were still thinking in myths. And because of that, much of his brilliance went unnoticed for generations. In his notebooks, Leonardo designed flying machines with flapping wings modeled after birds. He created detailed plans for a mechanical knight that could sit, wave, and move its jaw, a robot in an age of swords. He outlined the principles of hydraulics, optics, geology, and even solar energy, hundreds of years before those became formal fields of study. He theorized about the circulation of blood long before William Harvey discovered it. He drew the heart with such anatomical accuracy, it shocked modern surgeons when they finally saw his sketches. He described the concept of contact lenses. He wrote about the reflection of light, using words that today sound eerily like modern physics. But perhaps most astonishing of all, he never published these ideas. He never presented them at universities or courted scholars with them. Why? Maybe because the world wasn't ready, or maybe, deep down, he knew it. Leonardo wasn't interested in showing off what he knew. He was interested in the knowing itself. And so, many of his greatest ideas slept inside forgotten notebooks for centuries, like seeds waiting for the right soil. It wasn't until the modern era that we truly understood how far ahead he had been. Today, scientists and engineers revisit his designs not just with admiration, but with awe. His flying machines have been built. His anatomical insights have been confirmed. His mechanical inventions are studied as early glimpses of automation. And yet, there's a quiet tragedy in it too. Because Leonardo da Vinci dreamed of things the world couldn't yet build. He lived in a time that couldn't quite see what he saw. He wasn't just a man ahead of his generation. He was a man out of time. And maybe that's what made him timeless. Most people are either artists or scientists. They lean toward imagination or logic, beauty or structure. But Leonardo da Vinci lived in a rare space between the two, a place where art met science and neither was ever enough on its own. To Leonardo, a painting wasn't simply an image. It was an equation of light and perspective, anatomy and emotion. And science? Science wasn't cold or sterile. It was alive. It pulsed with the same beauty he saw in flowing hair or drifting clouds. When he studied the human body, he wasn't trying to prove a theory. He was trying to understand how nature drew. He dissected muscles to learn how arms moved in dance. He studied the curve of lips so he could paint a more believable smile. In his mind, the rules of geometry lived in the petals of flowers. The golden ratio, which governs so many of his compositions, also shaped pine cones and spiral galaxies. To Leonardo, the universe wasn't divided into disciplines. It was a masterpiece, and he was simply trying to copy it as faithfully as possible. That's what made his work so unique. His art was scientific, his science was poetic. In The Vitruvian Man, he didn't just sketch a body in a circle. He mapped the proportions of perfection, connecting the human form to the cosmos. In The Last Supper, he captured emotion through mathematical balance and psychological tension. Even the Mona Lisa, with its soft shadows and hypnotic gaze, was painted using optical illusions rooted in his understanding of vision. For Leonardo, the brush and the compass were not opposites, they were tools. And through them, he sought truth, not just what things looked like, but why they looked that way. Today, we build walls between disciplines, art, science, engineering, philosophy. But Leonardo, he lived without those walls. He proved that the more you understand something, the more beautifully you can express it. And that the more beautifully you express it, the deeper your understanding becomes. He wasn't trying to choose between two worlds. He was trying to show us they were always one. And in that unity, he discovered something most people never do, that the greatest truths are both measured and felt. Over the centuries, Leonardo da Vinci has become more than a man. He's become a myth. The word genius is often used to describe him, and rightly so. But in doing so, we sometimes forget that behind the endless inventions, the masterpieces, and the mirrored handwriting, was a human being. Leonardo was not a flawless figure from a storybook. He was deeply complex, a man full of contradictions. He was endlessly curious, yet often left things unfinished. He could design machines of war, but speak passionately against violence. He was adored by royalty and nobles, yet preferred the company of nature and silence. He was meticulous, brilliant, but also scattered, his notebooks jumping from heart valves to helicopter blades without warning. He could be warm and witty. He could also be private, withdrawn, even melancholic. Despite being surrounded by courts, commissions, and admirers, Leonardo's life was marked by a certain loneliness. Not the loneliness of isolation, but the kind that comes from seeing the world differently and having no one who sees it quite like you do. He struggled with deadlines, he lost commissions, he disappointed patrons, he sometimes doubted himself, he didn't finish most of what he started, and yet the things he did complete changed the course of human history. Leonardo da Vinci reminds us that greatness is messy, that brilliance doesn't always arrive in straight lines or tidy boxes. It drips out in sketches. It flickers between ideas. It wrestles with insecurity. The modern world celebrates output. Leonardo valued observation. Today, we praise multitasking. He mastered deep focus, spending hours watching birds or tracking the ripple of water in a stream. In a world that asked for answers, Leonardo never stopped asking questions. And maybe that's the truth behind the myth. He wasn't trying to be remembered. He was trying to understand. And because he followed that path with honesty, curiosity, and patience, he ended up becoming someone the world would never forget. He wasn't a saint. He wasn't a god. He was something far more inspiring, a flawed, fascinating human being who never stopped trying to see the world more clearly. More than 500 years have passed since Leonardo da Vinci took his final breath, and yet his influence feels anything but distant. His paintings still draw millions. His notebooks are still being studied. His questions still challenge us. And his legacy? It stretches across every corner of modern thought: art, science, engineering, medicine, philosophy, even space exploration. Few figures in history have left behind a legacy so universal, so lasting that they feel alive in every era. And yet, Leonardo never built an empire. He led no armies. He didn't publish great volumes of theory or hold a powerful title. What he left behind was not wealth, but wonder. He showed us that it's possible to live a life not driven by fame or productivity, but by curiosity. He didn't rush. He studied. He didn't pretend to have all the answers. He kept asking better questions. He didn't see the world in parts. He saw it as a vast, beautiful puzzle, one worth exploring with patience, awe, and humility. Even today, innovators look to Leonardo as the gold standard of creativity. Engineers study his machines. Doctors admire his anatomy. Artists chase his light and shadow. Designers quote his philosophy. Filmmakers, architects, teachers, all draw from the well he left behind. Why? Because Leonardo reminds us that the boundaries between disciplines are artificial, that art and science are not enemies, but partners in understanding truth, that the human spirit is capable of seeing connections where others see chaos. And perhaps most importantly, he reminds us that thinking slowly is not a weakness. In a world that races toward more content, more answers, more speed, Leonardo teaches us the power of stillness, of looking deeply, of asking not just what, but why. He lived long before electricity, airplanes, or the internet, but somehow he imagined all of them. He didn't just study the world, he expanded it, and in doing so, he left behind more than art or invention. He left behind permission for all of us to be curious, to wonder, to observe, and to dream boldly. Even if no one else understands it, that's not just a legacy, that's inspiration without an expiration date. Leonardo da Vinci lived a life that defied definition. He was not just one thing, he was many. An artist, a scientist, an inventor, a philosopher, a dreamer. But more than anything else, Leonardo was a seeker. He sought the truth behind a smile, the motion behind a bird's wing, the pattern behind a leaf, the soul behind the human form. He didn't chase greatness, he chased understanding, and in doing so he created greatness without ever needing to name it. His life was not without struggle. He faced rejection, frustration, unfinished projects, and a world that often couldn't keep up with his vision. But he remained faithful to one thing, always curiosity. It guided him from the hills of Vinci to the courts of kings. It filled his notebooks, it shaped his art, it whispered to him in quiet rooms, and carried him through times of uncertainty. And in the end, that's what made him timeless. Because Leonardo's legacy is not just what he left behind, it's what he ignited in others. Every artist who dares to see the world differently. Every scientist who asks why instead of just how. Every thinker who pauses to look closer, who sketches their thoughts, who stays awake a little longer just to follow a question. They are carrying his spirit forward. Even now, in a world of satellites and algorithms, Leonardo feels close. He lives in the curiosity of a child staring at the stars, in the hand of a designer shaping something beautiful and functional, in the quiet breath of someone watching a sunrise and wondering what makes the light bend that way. He is proof that imagination, when married with observation, is not just creativity, it's power. He left us with questions still unanswered, with machines never built, with pages that continue to reveal new wonders, and maybe that was his final gift, not the answers, but the invitation to keep looking. Because in every one of us, there is a bit of Leonardo, the quiet observer, the bold dreamer, the restless seeker. And his story? It's not just history, it's a reminder. that a single life, lived with wonder, can echo through eternity